No, you need to connect it. What is happening? Okay. Hasn't started recording. Mauricio, can we call him? Can he record? Can I call him? I'm gonna say. Okay.
And there will be audio, right?
Yes, there will be.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical difficulties, but we're going to get started, so please take your seats. Yeah.
He can record.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this LIPS presentation. Our speaker today is Roosbelinda Ca, Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at CUNY. My name is Diana Guo, and I'm a PhD student here at Columbia's Urban Planning Program and will be moderating this session. I will begin with a few brief logistical announcements before turning to introduce our speaker. We are recording today's lecture, so please remember this if you do not wish to be recorded. After the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. We will start Q&A around 2 to 2:15 p.m. so that we have enough time for everyone's questions. My co-organizer, Vanita, and I will be coordinating Q&A with attention to diversity and inclusion. So if you have already had a chance to ask a question, please allow others to do so before asking another one. To ask questions, please raise your hand and we will call you. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Roosbelinda Ca is an Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology at John Jay College. Dr. Cardenas's research brings the histories of post-colonial racial formations to bear on contemporary struggles over citizenship, national belonging, and social justice in Latin America. As a politically engaged scholar, her research is intended to produce knowledge that can be activated for social change. Dr. Cardenas has published in academic outlets such as Latin American and Caribbean Ethnic Studies, Social Studies of Science, and the Journal of Peasant of Studies. Her 2024 book, Raising Two Fists: Struggles for Black Citizenship in Multicultural Colombia, is the product of ethnographic research tracing Black anti-racist organizing in Colombia for over 2 decades. So please join me in welcoming Roosbelinda Ca.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Okay. All right. Let me get myself settled over here. There's a lot of machines. Okay. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. And welcome. Still kind of position this. Bienvenidos. I wanted first to thank the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and especially to Mauricio Orellana for organizing the event, although I know he couldn't be here today, and to Professor Hiba Buakar, who I had the privilege she was my colleague several years ago at Hampshire College. So I wanted to thank her for also inviting me to share my work today. My name is Roosbelinda Ca. I'm a cultural anthropologist and a professor at John Jay College, and I'm humbled to see all your faces. And I'm very excited to share with you a preview of the work that has consumed me for more than 2 decades. Gracias por acompañarme. So I wish to start by saying that this is deeply personal work for me. I will be sharing excerpts of this book that I wrote about one of the places I call home. Because our time today is limited, I will introduce you to the work and then I will give you snippets of 3 stories that I delve into in the book. I will not flesh them out, but hopefully I will stir your interest enough to invite you to keep reading. This book is an analysis of struggles against racism and for liberation that I have had the privilege to bear witness to. And it is not intended as a detached pursuit of knowledge. Rather, it is inspired by the Jamaican thinker and teacher, Stuart Hall, when he beautifully reminded us that theory is, quote, but a detour on the way to something more important. So with that, I begin. Okay, this is going to be a little more challenging to toggle than I thought. Okay, on May 20th, should I figure out how to do this first? Just here and back. There we go. I got it. Okay. On May 20th, 2017, the city of Buenaventura, Colombia's blackest city, was convulsing. The day before, tens of thousands of people declared a general strike, and things went awry. Armed men infiltrated the peaceful protests, instigating violence and triggering what the national media described as out-of-control looting and rioting. When talks between the government and the strike's organizing committee broke down, the day's outcome was dismal. More than 40 people detained, numerous civilians injured, a state-imposed curfew, and a prohibition on further protests. That Saturday morning, Bonaverenses filled the streets for the 5th consecutive day, declaring their city in a state of, quote, social, economic, and ecological emergency. They wore white shirts and donned red, blue, and yellow, shouting, "El pueblo no se rinde, carajo." The people will not give up, damn it. To show Colombia, this is a quote, and the national government that Buenaventura exists. The government responded by increasing the police and anti-riot units by 500 men. Soldiers surveyed the city from helicopters and gassed protesters from tanks. This powerful mobilization put several ironies on display. I just wanted to let you take a look at the phrase "El pueblo no se rinde, carajo." Okay, the first irony, the first and most glaring, that Buenaventura, an impoverished city of 400,000 people with no reliable potable water system or even a second-tier hospital, is Colombia's largest port, the entry and exit point of outrageous economic wealth. How is it that a city from which 60% of Colombia's coffee exports are shipped suffers from a 68% unemployment rate? How is it that a maritime port at the mouth of 7 rivers, situated in one of the wettest regions in the world, has daily water rations? Bonaverenses raise these questions loudly with their demands for potable water, employment, and education. But more than that, Bonaverenses demanded an end to a long history of plunder. Videos, photos, and audio circulating on social media and in the mainstream press assured viewers everywhere that protesters would not relent until the government agreed to an economic development plan in which Bonaverenses had a voice and from which they reaped the benefits. Until then, they would continue to disrupt business as usual. Second irony is that when the protests erupted, then President Juan Manuel Santos was in Washington, D.C. negotiating the U.S. foreign aid package for Colombia's so-called post-war rebuilding. Following a 4-year negotiation that formally ended Latin America's longest civil war in November of 2016, Colombia had begun a long-awaited transition to peace. While President Santos was being internationally recognized for his work to bring peace to Colombia, he also got the Nobel Peace Prize, Buenaventura continued to be one of the deadliest places in the world. By the time of the strike, the peace accords with the FARC, Colombia's largest guerrilla group, had been signed. And Bonaverenses, like the rest of their fellow Colombians, were eager to experience the long-awaited peace that President Santos touted. Instead, Colombia had become the deadliest place in the world to be a human rights activist. A final irony has to do with the date of the protests. May 21st is a commemoration of Colombia's abolition of slavery. Since 2001, it has been marked by symposia and book launches and extravagant cultural events, such as gastronomic festivals, dance performances, film screenings, and concerts intended to proudly display Afro-Colombians' national contributions. But rather than spend the day celebrating Bonaerenses, 89% of whom are Black, spent that first peaceful day of commemoration by doing what they had been doing since before abolition, resisting state violence to insist that they too were entitled to citizenship. To do this, they relied on communities of daily resistance that they had built from their shared experiences of marginalization. But they also relied on a larger community of allies that extended beyond the city, beyond the Pacific region, and even beyond Colombia. As they braved the militarized streets on that Sunday morning, the more than 50,000 bodies on the streets of Buenaventura were joined in remote solidarity by their Black brothers and sisters in Quibdó and in Cali, in Panama and in Brazil, and in Washington, D.C. and Chicago. As I followed the events unfolding in Buenaventura for weeks, I had a growing sense that there was something distinct and important about this strike. Initially, what captured my attention was the way that strikers combined fury with lucid analysis. While I had seen Afro-Colombians mobilize for resources and labor rights against government corruption and corporate cost environmental degradation, Buenaventura strikers demanded all at once. And in doing so, they beautifully articulated an intersectional theory of structural racism. The seemingly disparate list of their demands was a concerted attack on the many ugly heads of anti-Black racism. They denounced economic exploitation, social invisibilization, political marginalization, and the brutal disregard for Black lives all in one breath. But there was something else that seemed different and that crystallized when I came across this striking photo published in one of Colombia's largest newspapers. El Espectador. Look at the two signs that the protesters are carrying here. One reads, Chocó, which is a department of Colombia and a region on the Pacific, and Buenaventura are also Colombia. While the other, which includes a drawing of a raised fist, reads, Pueblo Negro en pie de lucha, Black people standing in struggle, followed by the hashtags, I am Buenaventura, I am Chocó. The photo captures the distinctiveness of what I had been struggling to articulate. We see in these two signs a dual strategy being unfolded. In this one, there's a demand for full citizenship rights as members of the Colombian nation. And in the other, we see a call for a diasporic Black nation, un pueblo negro, to stand with them and struggle. Buenaventura was not only a protest of disenfranchised citizens, although it was that. Buenaventura was not only a call to Black diasporic solidarity, although it was also that. Buenaventura was an unapologetic instance of a two-fisted Black mobilization that did both of these things simultaneously. And that is what I call the struggle for Black citizenship. I was not in Buenaventura during this historical uprising. I joined international supporters from my home in New York, signing letters, circulating documents, spreading the word. I've been following Black mobilizations in Colombia for over 20 years, both from abroad and from up close during the 5 years that I lived in Bogota. I've accompanied the work of two of Colombia's largest Black organizations that I'm going to tell you about today, the National Association of Displaced Afro-Colombians, AFRODES, and the Process of Black Communities, the PCN, working with them to negotiate policy with the national government and in their more local and grassroots initiatives. I have visited villages in the Pacific region, and I have become acquainted with the struggles of Afro-Colombians in major cities as well. Over the years, I have collaborated with Black activists in Colombia as they shift their political strategies, adapt their discourses, and build new networks of support. This book is a description of that trajectory and a reflection on the limits and on the possibilities of the struggles for justice that I identify as a pursuit of Black citizenship. It's also an ethnographic analysis of the multiple forms of violence that Afro-Colombians face, showing how, even in a self-declared multicultural country like Colombia, structural racism continues to condense historical and contemporary forms of violence. I build on a large body of scholarship on multiculturalism to advance a capacious vision of Black citizenship as, and this is a definition, a pursuit that makes the man to the nation state and is anchored in an African diasporic understanding of justice, marked as an Afrocentric ethos that centers the care for all life. This is the vision that Francia Marquez, the current vice president, mobilized across all of Colombia as her rallying cry during her presidential campaign. The pursuit of a life without fear, the promise of vivir sabroso, to live deliciously. But I'll come back to this. This last insight is heir to the work of Black women like Castriela Hernandez Reyes, Charlene Mollett, Courtney Morris, Tisha Khan Perry, Kristen Smith, and Aurora Vergara Figueroa, who note that the lived experiences of violence that Black people in the Americas have endured are a powerful source for a diasporic vision of justice, and that Black women in particular exercise this vision in their daily strategies to survive and even thrive in the midst of formidable forces of death. I echo these scholars in focusing less on Black victimization and more on the ways in which Black people harness this accumulated knowledge to envision and put into practice more liberatory futures for all. Ultimately, my exploration in this book is hopeful, not as a naive celebration of a fulfilled accomplishment, but as an appraisal of Black citizenship's possibilities, and as an exercise in imagining new forms of anti-racism and freedom. So let me give you a little bit of context. In the 1990s, there was an important change in the definition of citizenship and national inclusion across Latin America. As a result of fierce mobilizations that swept the region, many governments declared their countries multicultural and granted special rights for Black and Indigenous people. In Colombia, this shift towards multiculturalism hinged on the idea that the country was not culturally homogenous, but rather that there were multiple ethnic communities, and it was ethnic, that's important, with cultures distinct from the dominant one, which was imagined as a mixed race, but whitened Euro-Andean Criollo culture. For Afro-Colombians, the most far-reaching manifestation of multiculturalism was the passage of a law, Law 70 in 1993, which recognized Black communities as culturally distinct and granted them specific rights, including the right to collective titling of ancestral lands across the Pacific region. And there you can see a map of some of the lands that were collectively titled as a result of the law. The recognition was modeled on Indigenous activists' mobilization of ethnic, not racial, difference, which emphasized Native peoples' autochthony, their belonging to the land, and their collective history as a distinct pueblo, a people, a nation. The multicultural turn is noteworthy not only because it ushered in profound differences in understandings of Blackness in Colombia, but also because it was at this moment at which mobilization of organized Black politics proliferated in Colombia. As Tiana Cashel has noted, it was at this point that political struggles began to be explicitly articulated as Black struggles waged by Black subjects. Now, multiculturalism has fallen short of delivering inclusive forms of citizenship for Black and Indigenous people. Several decades later, the overall balance of its political impact is at best lackluster and at worst perverse. Where its radical potential has not been seriously undermined, multiculturalism has been co-opted or retooled for ulterior ends. There's a robust literature that analyzes this in detail, and I'm not going to attempt to summarize it or its lessons here. but I do want to highlight two contradictory forces that it unleashed. One, on the one hand, a sense of national renewal and racial reconciliation offered by multicultural reforms that has strengthened state legitimacy and its associated capitalist expansion. On the other hand, Afro-Colombian activists have found creative and sometimes counterintuitive ways to use its tools to further their own political agendas, sometimes against state legitimacy and against capitalist expansion. For example, they have expanded the narrow space of cultural rights to demand a national reckoning with anti-Black racism, cases of Black autonomy. Throughout the book, I assess the political outcomes of this state-led multicultural rights regime, focusing on the political possibilities created by and for Afro-Colombians since the 1990s until the present. While the outcome is far from triumphant, I'm still interested in analyzing how multiculturalism has unfolded and in its unexpected entanglements. And I make room for the possibility of radical political emergences. To be clear, multiculturalism has not been a very fertile terrain for Black freedom, but in it, Afro-Colombians have cultivated political visions that hold the promise of future flourishing. Let me return to Buenaventura to illustrate. The dual-fisted strategy that I call Black citizenship became starkly apparent in Buenaventura, where protests began to bear fruit after 21 days. After an initial stalemate, various breakdowns in talks, and a final 40-hour meeting between the government and the strike's organizing committee, both parties signed an agreement. Bonaverenses, such as community leader Hamilton Valencia, celebrated the agreement enthusiastically, hopeful at the promise of fully participating in civil and social life, and proud to have, quote, honored their heroic ancestors who had survived insult, cruelty, and servitude against the structural inequities shaped by exclusion, racism, and voracious capitalism, unquote. Afro-Colombians were joined in the celebration by voices in the diaspora who sent African proverbs and ashe, while reiterating their commitment to bear witness as the implementation of the agreements unfolded. Although Bonaverenses were keenly aware of the hard work that lay ahead, the general mood following the end of the strike was triumphant. And activists were emboldened by the abundant expressions of Black international solidarity that poured in. In anticipation of the difficult journey ahead, the strikers organized in citizenship councils to oversee the implementation of the agreements. But the limitation of rights-based struggles were soon confirmed by the government's continued breaches and foot dragging. And Bonaverenses' optimism quickly turned to frustration as they realized, once more, that the state's promise to extend basic civil rights was no panacea. But the sobering reminder that rights are insufficient in protecting Black life struck with full force a few months later, when Temístocles Machado, a local community activist who had compiled an impressive file documenting land disputes in the area, and a leader of the civic strike, was murdered in cold blood. And that's Don Temis. Following Don Temis' assassination, voices rose again far and wide, denouncing the untimely death and demanding justice in the struggle to protect Black lives. In New York City, the Amsterdam News heeded Afro-Colombians' request for, quote, an outcry from the African diaspora. While in Buenaventura, members of the Civic Strike's organizing committee boldly reminded their fellow Colombians that they would prevail, chanting, por nuestros muertos, ni un minuto de silencio. For our dead, not a minute of silence. Temístocles' death, as well as the response that followed from Black people across the Americas, suggests that the pursuit of Black citizenship is sutured together by a diasporic thread, which is relentless in confronting the politics of death. These politics include projects to displace, disenfranchise, criminalize, and otherwise annihilate life in all its expressions, human and non-human. Of course, Afro-pessimist scholars, both inside and outside of Latin America, have long paid attention to untimely death as a structuring characteristic of the Black experience. And this book is heir to their insights. At the same time, I focus less on the overdetermined experience of Blackness as social death that these authors describe in order to explore the ways in which Afro-Colombians push against these deadly forces. Yes, given the context of a long and crude civil war, the Colombian case offers an exceptional opportunity to analyze how the multiple forces of death unfurl, both in their daily insidiousness and in their gruesome spectacles. By the same token, by following Afro-Colombian activists' daily lives and organized responses to these daily forces, I hope to glean valuable lessons to transform, as Francia Marquez insists, the politics of death into politics of life. So let me tell you a little bit about these three stories that I trace in the book. The first, this is a story, it takes place on the Mira River, of what happened to the multicultural promise, which was extended by the law that I told you about, Law 70, that granted Black communities collective land rights in 1993. It is grounded in a particular case of the Mira River Valley, a beautiful territory that you can see there, at the crossroads of multiple geographies of violence, which include the expansion of large oil palm plantations, armed disputes for the control of land for the cultivation of coca, and for trade routes for the transportation of cocaine. It also includes the government's myriad programs to allegedly alleviate poverty and reduce illicit crops, which go hand in hand with the intensified militarization enabled by US foreign aid. It is the story of 11,000 Afro-Colombians working to harness the benefits extended by the law to craft their own vision of a delicious life on the 46,000 hectares that they titled in 2003. It is both an old struggle against racial dispossession and a new and creative response in the context of a multicultural state and the brutal violence of neoliberal governance. It is a success story of Mireños, and you see the image of some of them there, building a sense of place and community that is expansive and flexible while resolutely rooted and cohesive. It is a story of fierce and loving placemaking that flies in the face of the Colombian nation's settler colonial fantasy, which tries to subsume the difference between the settler and its others under the illusion of national camaraderie. It is also a story of sedimented indignities, which expose the fact that Mireños have not yet reached even the most minimal expressions allegedly guaranteed by their inclusion in the nation. This is the second set of stories. And these stories begin in the aftermath of the worst moment in Colombia's civil war in the late to mid 1990s, which unsurprisingly hit Black communities disproportionately. So much so that by 2007, Colombia topped the list of internally displaced people worldwide, IDPs. And 79%, I'll say this again, 79% of the Black inhabitants that had collective territories had been forcefully displaced from those title lands. Although this was indeed a moment of spectacular violence, I follow Aurora Vergara Figueroa in seeing forced displacement not as an anomaly, but rather as another manifestation of the longue durée experience of this tierra, lived by Afro-descendants in the Americas since they were first uprooted from Africa. And also, I follow the decolonizing work of scholars such as Lamia Mornier, who explore the productive potentials of living in and encountering violence daily. This is not in an attempt to underplay the very real suffering caused by the war and racism, but rather an effort to document and amplify the political emergencies that surface even in the midst of destruction. And so this is a place of resettlement, urban resettlement of people who were displaced from the Pacific region to the outskirts of Bogota. So I focus on the work of a small group of IDPs, of internally displaced people, who in the late 1990s mobilized to make demands to the state, both as Colombian citizens in need of humanitarian protection and as ethnic subjects, entitled to differential forms of reparations for the war. I show with ethnographic detail how, in the process of mobilizing as desplazados or as IDPs and as an ethnic people, they unleashed a powerful movement of racial recognition. The law didn't provide for anti-racist reparations, but they found a way, which lay the foundations for a more open denunciation of racism than had been possible. Again, this is an incomplete victory. It includes the triumphant story of passing landmark laws that protect Black war victims differentially. And also, it is a sobering reflection of the dangers of doing this. Specifically, I analyze how this strategy of tethering rights to victimization ends up narrowing the definition of citizenship. And still, it is the unlikely story of how, while mobilizing around humanitarian aid for IDPs, Black activists unequivocally incorporated the denunciation of racism into the political landscape in Colombia. And this can no longer be undone. It is now part and parcel of politics every day. In the final chapter of the book, I focus on what I saw as the latest, most recent iteration of the fight for Black citizenship, which surged in the midst of the 2016 peace accords in part and the so-called post-war project of national reconciliation. And I did not include a translation, but these are some numbers of deaths of human rights activists after the peace accords. I know that the peace accords did not bring the much awaited abatement of violence. And I pause to acknowledge the specificity of Black death, laying out a theory of anti-Black genocide and its flip side, Black peace, that is heir to Afro-pessimists and Black optimists alike. I trace a budding movement for historical reparations born of Afro-Colombians' experience with the peace negotiation process, in which they had to, once again, fight for a seat at the table. I also note that this growing movement for historical reparations, so that's different than war reparations, is articulated in an African diasporic political network, and that Colombians are both contributors and heirs to the work of Caribbean leaders, Black Lives Matter protesters, and international activists across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, who are working to rewrite the dominant narrative that erases the memory of slavery as a thing of the past. Following scholar and activist Esther Ojulari, I note a remarkable particularity in Afro-Colombians' contribution to the movement for historical reparations. Because of their long history anchoring political demands in collective forms of redress, Afro-Colombian activists that had been immersed in these struggles for war victims at home have a deeply structural vision of justice to contribute globally. I end the book with an electrifying story of how Black visions of peace can reverberate powerfully as the promise to protect all life. Maybe you recognize her, and if not, in a minute. This is a story of a young gold miner, singer, and single mother from the mountains of the Colombian Southwest, who has waged a fierce struggle against the deadly forces of capitalism and the white supremacist state's complicity to eradicate life in exchange for profit. This is the story of Francia Marquez's journey to become vice president. It is also the story of her relentless pursuit to cultivate a politics of life, nurtured by her people's experience of vivir sabroso in the poisoned soil of the national electoral system. And this is Francia when Angela Davis visited Colombia and she came to her territory for the first time, and also mobilizing women walking from the mountains of the southwestern Colombia to Bogota to protest illegal mining, gold mining. So allow me to close by reading from the book. Francia's election as vice president, her righteous occupation of a place of power in the heart of the Criollo nation is nothing short of astounding. It is, without a doubt, a dramatic and hopeful interruption of business as usual. Her campaign, run entirely on the grassroots fuel of those who believe in her, started with $7,000, invigorated the masses. I had the privilege of accompanying her on the final days of her vice presidential campaign. I witnessed the power of Francia as an electrifying wave of people standing to greet her at the Pascual Guerrero Stadium in Cali, as an auditorium full of young women, trans and cis, clamoring against misogyny in Medellin, as a sober meeting of indigenous leaders discussing rural reform in Cauca, and as the faithful protection of the Guardia Cimarrona, the Maroon Guard. I've been witnessing the power of Francia for many years, and although she is truly charismatic, I dare say that her enormous appeal is not because of who she is, but because of what she promises. Vivir sabroso. Oh, not yet. The promise of Vivir sabroso is capacious, but precise. It entails living without fear, fear of untimely death, fear of precarious life, fear of being violated. The promise of Vivir sabroso is most centrally a project to end the politics of death. And in this sense, it is the fiercest iteration of the pursuit of Black citizenship that I have seen. The right to vivir sabroso is a demand for inclusion in the nation, but that nation must be remade, not in its colonial semblance, but as something else entirely, as a project that harnesses the experiences of the marginalized and the exploited and brings them front and center. Francia used the image of Uruguayan poets that call them the nobodies, the nadies. With Francia and her nadies, Eduardo Galeano is his name. With Francia and her nadies in power, there is a chance for the pursuit of Black citizenship to be carried out within the state, as well as outside and against it. Vivir sabroso holds the power of an alternative to the extractive economies of savage neoliberalism, of a reckoning with historical forms of violence, of a long postponed attainment of peace as the triumph of the politics of life. And yet, we must not forget that this liberatory vision is now being launched from within the master's house, as Audre Lorde would note. Is it possible to carry out a decolonial project against the racist, patriarchal, and exploitative structures that sustain death, while occupying the very center of Colombia's most paradigmatic colonial institution? Can the nation state be recreated from its entrails? The challenges and contradictions of this project are indeed formidable. The memory and enduring power of the Creole national vision, unapologetically white, masculine, and modeled on European modernity, is omnipresent. And still, Francia and the Nadies' presence in the government holds the promise of transformation of the very state apparatus and of the substance of the nation. Likely unaccomplishable in 4 years. We have 2 more to go, but hopeful nonetheless. And that is the moderately conservative hope I wish to close with a full awareness of the persistent structures that continue to wreak death in all its ugly forms, and with the hope that we can continue to learn from those experiences of violence, to claim the nation state only to transform it. Perhaps the project for Black citizenship involves undoing the very thing that is being reclaimed. But hold on, I want to show you a very short video. Okay.
De verdad que qué tal como el pleno de Soy Porque Somos, claro. 1.000.000 de votos nada más, ¿no? 780. Mucho.
Gracias por ese camino que han decidido hacer, que no es el triunfo de Francia, es el triunfo del pueblo colombiano, ¿sí? Porque es el pueblo colombiano que decide el voto o la bala. En muchos momentos decidimos la bala. Bañamos nuestro país en sangre. Hoy tenemos la posibilidad de elegir el voto que sea capaz de poner en el centro la vida. Con eso entonces la tarea no está concluida, esto apenas empieza. Vamos pueblo carajo, que el pueblo no se sirve. Juro a Dios y al pueblo cumplir fielmente la Constitución y las leyes de Colombia. También juro ante mis ancestros y ancestras, hasta que la dignidad se haga costumbre.
Thank you.
So now we'll field some questions.
It's a great photo, so I just wanted to hit a full screen. Don't be shy. Thank you.
Thank you. My question, I think maybe you were talking about the Asian policy, that recognizes ethnic
Yeah.
distinctions
Mhm.
versus racial ones. Because, you know, in America, Colombians live in mestizos, and that's a strange, but also kind of racial without a bit of indigenous. So I'm wondering how that fits into that kind of, racial ethnic distinction that, that acceptable because
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm curious about what sounds strange to you? Which is the part that sounds strange to you?
well, I think I sometimes struggle to understand what that, like, what the ethnic versus racial distinction would actually.
Right.
Are, I guess, our indigenous people.
Right. So I think in fact, it's really fortunate that you mentioned this mestizo identity, because that's a lot of what these laws and these mobilizations were working against, right? The idea that not only Colombia, but most Latin American nations are mestizo nations that are mixed race. And for the most part, the mix includes indigenous and European. In some cases, there's a recognition of African ancestry, but in any case, there's a myth of homogeneity and equality. So that is a lot of the back history of this that I didn't go into in a lot of detail, but has been written a lot, is that there was a lot of this mobilization that turned into Law 70 began as campesino mobilization, peasant mobilization for land rights, collective land rights, not individual private land rights. And what enabled the government to actually recognize this was not racism, was not a recognition that Black people deserved differential rights because of a history of racism, right? The way that they mobilized, and this was around the 1991 Constitution, was that civil society participated in a remaking of the nation, and there were indigenous representatives at the Constitutional Assembly. There were no Black representatives at the Constitutional Assembly. And what they argued was that they were a distinct people, nation. Right, and for the first time, this idea that that it was multicultural nation, it was a nation with many nations, with different customs, with different origins, with different ideas of territory, with different notions towards resources and habits and practices, productive practices. And that was legible to the state. That was acceptable. It was not acceptable to talk about a history of racism. And that was what was written into law. And the discourse and also the practice was an ethnic practice. It was about cultural difference, very much modeled on indigenous rights, Native American rights, indigenous, right? But part of what I show in the book and what I argue is that as a result of the massive displacement from those lands, and when people come into the city, people from all over Colombia, right, that they were no longer being distinguished by their culture. They were being racialized, racially interpolated, right? In a place like Bogota, which has very clear, in a place like Colombia, which has a very clear regionalization of race, right? Where Black people were thought of as out of place in a city like Bogota. And then everybody was interpolated as Black independently of where they were from, what they spoke, what they ate, what religion there were. It wasn't a culture distinction, it was a racial distinction. And so as a result of this, also new solidarities emerged and new political struggles emerge. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Yeah.
So, yeah, first of all, again, thanks so much for the presentation. I can sense also the topic that it's really close to your heart, like very passionate or invested in it.
Yeah.
So what I'm curious about is that with Rosa's victory, you can see that she has electorally galvanized the Black community and make them feel that they can have the table to stand, their voice to be heard.
Yeah.
Have you seen that being materialized elsewhere in the overall structure? Do you feel the community has beyond her now being more involved in affairs?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. And, you know, you're right that this is it's a very personal, like, I feel very personally invested in these stories that I tell. They're stories that I feel like I have been a part of as they have unfolded. And some of these stories, to be completely frank, we never imagined that we're going to go in the direction that they did. I met Francia in 2009, I believe, when she was the last image that you saw in the video. She was organizing against incursions into her collective territory of, there was a title that the government had given for open pit gold mining that she mobilized against. And they used this law the law 70, although her community did not have a land title, for also complicated reasons about what is ethnic recognition. They weren't legible as ethnic subjects. But going back to your question about how this has manifested, I think what I have followed more has been symbolic, has been like a symbolic shaking of, even if you're familiar with Colombia at all, right? But the presence of Black people in the heart of power, in the center of power, donning, symbolic African symbols, has shaken the vision that Colombia is a mestizo, primarily a mestizo nation, a mestizo white Creole nation, right? A mestizo nation that always aspired to be whitened. I think there have also been some concrete manifestations. For example, Francia as vice president, although there have been a lot of efforts to empower her from her legitimate position, has launched diplomatic rapprochement with several African countries that have been fiercely critiqued in the most racist, outrageous ways. I think you also obviously have a very complicated political situation in which people that came from these organizations and from grassroots political organizing are vying for positions of power. And that sometimes that means that struggles are undermined for personal gain. That has also happened. But I think, to be completely 100% frank, I don't have a lot of faith in the state. But I think that the symbolic consequences of occupying that space are powerful. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Here's after this event, we have surroundings. So
Impact on.
impact in terms of political use.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing because also there's noise in the back.
I was saying, does this event actually have any other impact among its surrounding countries, so Mexico or Venezuela or Brazil, in terms of political and adjustments?
Yeah. I'm thinking about this out loud. I mean, I think Colombia was sort of, since the 1990s, was an exemplary case of Black mobilization across Latin America, and the collective land titling, I mean, it was massive. It amounted to a land reform that Colombia never had, right? And what that actually means in terms of material control of resources, at least on paper, is powerful. And some countries followed suit. Ecuador, for example, which is right next, followed suit, and it followed the leadership of Colombia in that model of Black rights. And it was sort of a moment in other places. Some places preceded it, like Nicaragua had an autonomous Black region way before Colombia. But Colombia, because of its size and because of its size and the reverberation, it really, I do think that it became a model of multicultural rights. Now, since the electoral triumph, I'm unsure. Let's wait and see. I mean, I do think, again, that Francia has focused on creating diasporic diplomatic ties that maybe will outlive her tenure as vice president. I'm not sure. I think that is yet to be seen. And I'm thinking, I mean, I think some of the impact is also articulated with what some people have described as a return of the so-called pink tide in Latin America, of some governments coming back to the left, and Colombia being a main force in that.
I have a question about, you mentioned tethering rights to victimization, and I'm just wondering what the implications of that are, and I'm guessing in this context, in some ways inevitable for that to happen, but in the end of the day, moving forward, since that and like ties to anti-politicalism and the social category of blackness and victimhood, and sort of being able to live within that, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, are you a little bit skeptical?
I'm not, no.
I think healthily, so, yeah.
I'm not skeptical. I think my question is really more about how to move forward. So you mentioned the politics of death turning into politics of life.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, in the context, it's probably inevitable to have rights outside of the victimization because of what was going on. So I'm just wondering about what the process can look like in kind of a transformation into something that's not just victimization.
Absolutely, yeah. No, thank you for the question. When I was thinking about which talk to give here, I debated between going into one of the chapters in detail in which I outlined that in a lot more ethnographic detail and doing sort of an overarching view of the book. I decided for the latter. But in one of the chapters, I go into that in a lot of detail, right? What happens when it seems like at a particular moment, and this has changed, but particularly at the beginning of the 2000s, because of the legal frameworks that are hyper visibilize war victims, and especially Black war victims and Indigenous war victims, because there's sort of a confluence of multiculturalism and war victims' rights. There's a moment for sort of a creation of a new political subject, but that political subject it doesn't project into the future, right? It has a self-annihilating logic, right? And also it makes it seem as if the injustice is a result of the present moment rather than a historical past. So those are some really serious dangers of that articulation. So I do trace that, and also it creates a hierarchy of victimization, right? And when the state is just, I recognize you because you're a war victim, and that you literally have a card and you have to prove it, and that's how you get rights, even the most basic rights like education and housing. It's fucked up. I mean, to say the least. So. And at the same time, it's what people make do with to make politics and open up new spaces. So then this reparations, which was a war reparations, and it was written into law and recognized by the Constitutional Court, makes way to historical reparations, which was, I also trace in the book, which was unthinkable, right? In 2005, for example, there was a commission that was created by the government for war reparations. And some of the proponents that were in the commission, some of the members of the commission were Black activists. And they proposed, like, can we think about the articulation of the fact that we are disproportionately displaced with our historical racism and dispossession? And they said, what are you talking about? This makes no sense. It makes no sense. It's illegible. Right? So at that moment, it was unthinkable, but eventually it has become thinkable. And now with certain people in power, right? For example, the vice presidency has sponsored a Center for Research for Historical Reparations. That's another consequence, another material consequence. So it's sort of putting the wedge in the small opening and seeing how you can open it from that. Yeah.
For that, like, last question in response to that, because that tying of rights to like an essentialized identity of like ethnicity or race or victimhood, I think we see it a lot these days. And so I am very skeptical that I'm very concerned about that, and that we're it as a strategy to helps me understand it better. I can't help but compare what you just presented to how I understand American politics.
Okay.
And how, instead of like a left to right political spectrum, I kind of understand it as a circle, right, where, you know, of authoritarianism, but the left and right discourse dominates American politics so much. And the first example that you showed, in Venezuela, that it feels like a context that like organized abandonment and like personal geography, where that really is example
exemplify.
Mhm.
When I've been to that and how movements of kind of how they are geography, I think that that's really political. I'm
Yeah.
wondering in the context of what seems like a people's movement here of really electing someone that the field represents them and represents this new qualities of life. If you've seen, if there's a different like widespread approach to understanding politics, that's not just nothing. If there's a different way to do it that better helps define these like collective goals.
I love that question. Thank you for that. I'm not sure if I can compare it to US politics. Because that's not where my mind and attention is, but I think I can think about it in the same context of Latin American politics in the left-right spectrum. I think that this articulation or this joining of Francia and Petro, I don't know if you're familiar with the current president, but Petro is a former guerrilla, a member of the M19, which was, the primary understanding of politics in Latin America since the Cuban Revolution has been a left-right, sort of Marxist, peasant-driven political spectrum, and he comes from that. It's the first ever left-wing government to be in power in Colombia ever since Colombia exists as an independent nation. And I think it's I think that Francia actually was key in what's the word, like sparking an articulation that spoke to a really broad sector of the population that may not have identified strictly as left-wing, but she really, she really resonated with feminists in cities. She really resonated with people who were fighting against or for trans rights, with people who were environmental activists. She came to be known primarily as an environmental activist. But I think it renewed the idea of left-right in a way that was fresher than what came out of, the Colombia's war of the association of the guerrillas with the left and the dictatorships, the military dictatorships of the right, for example. So I think I haven't thought about this strictly this way, but I do think it's a renewal of how we think about the left. Which is promising.
I guess I just, kind of like all of it with another question for you, and just wondering, you say this came to my mind, there's this thought, and I'm just wondering, like, with the entrenched power of Colombia and like that, right, the very historical, colonial, right? What do you think will happen in 2 years? Like, is there gonna be like, no, is there gonna be backlash, or like, there might be that project built for it to.
You mean beyond Colombia or within Colombia?
No, within, just like within, like the next election.
Already in the 2 years since they have come to power, their legitimacy has been very undermined. Their ability to actually make significant change has been very undermined. She has been the target of outrageous racist attacks. Although Petro has been an important international voice, I don't know if you have followed him, but he has been an important international voice, casting a place for Colombia in things such as the war in Palestine.
Yeah.
And withdrawing from arms trades with Israel, for example. So he has been bold in a way that I think has set a tone for the region, but in a different way. It's not the same alignment of left and right that we imagined before. I do think that it's a new path. I don't think that, I don't know, right? I don't have a crystal ball, but it's not looking good for the future of their political movement. Francia has a separate political movement. She ran for president first. And in the primaries, she had the second highest number of votes across the political spectrum. And really, I think some analysts, and I agree, say that Petro won thanks to her, because she was able to articulate across distinct constituencies. So her movement remains, what she has said, what I have heard from her is that she doesn't plan on remaining in politics, but her movement, perhaps. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
So that concludes our Q&A, and thank you so much on behalf of GSAP and Urban Planning. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today for your wonderful presentation. Thanks also to everyone who joined us today for LIPS. We're here again next week with Candace Fujikane, Professor of English at University of Hawaii, who will be giving a talk about planning and disaster capitalism. So thank you.
Thanks. I don't have anything here. Here.
Oh,
and my USB.
USB.
Hola. Ay, qué bueno. ¿Cómo se llama? Toma.